Hello, boys. Hope all of you are fine and safe at home. In this critical condition of coronavirus, we are bound to stay at home. But as we are getting so much time at home, so we can utilize the time in proper way. We have to study hard at home so that we can make a better preparation for all kind of exam. As soon as the school starts, you will just given your exam schedule, and then you won't get enough time for making a good preparation. So boys, please concentrate on your classes, be regular in your studies, and just try to take the better preparation for your exam for a better future. So let's start our class. In my previous class, I was just discussing about chapter 3 force, and this was a review class. And today's class I will try to cover some other topics on rest of the topics of this chapter, and then we will just proceed to mathematical term or CQ types questions. And last class, in our previous class, we had a discussion about force, laws of motion. We had discussed about so many topics. Today we'll try to discuss about frictional force, an important term of this chapter. What is frictional force? This is a kind of resistive force. The obstruction produced against the motion on the contact plane of two objects is friction, and the force involved in this process is called frictional force. As I have mentioned earlier, this is a resistive force. That means when two objects tries to move after one another, then a resistive force works here, and that force is called frictional force. Definitely this force works in opposite direction of the applied force, as this is a resistive force. So you have known about frictional force. Types of friction: there are many variations of friction and frictional forces. For example, static friction, sliding friction, rolling friction, fluid friction. You have to know about the definition of this friction, and there are examples as well for your multiple choice questions. What is static friction? Due to static friction, we can walk. This is a very important point. We can work due to static friction. This frictional force develops when two objects are at rest relative to each other. When two objects are at rest relative to each other, then their resistance is created between them, and this is called static friction. Sliding friction. What is sliding friction? This frictional force develops when an object is in motion relative to another object, where in static friction two objects were at rest relative to each other, but in terms of sliding friction, there one object is in motion relative to another. This friction works while breaking a cycle. Whenever anyone tries to break a cycle, and he tries to seize the motion of the cycle, then this friction works there. Third one is rolling friction. When an object moves by rolling on a surface, then the friction is called rolling friction. Attaching wheels on all kinds of vehicles is the example of this friction. Whenever we just try to pull anything, for example, trolley bag, whenever we use trolley bag, we see that because of using wheels, the movement of bags, the movement of the instruments become quite easier. So this friction is rolling friction, and the common example of rolling friction is attaching or using wheels on vehicles. The fourth one is fluid friction. As we know, there are two types of fluid. One is liquid and another is in gaseous form. So when an object moves in a fluid substance, then the friction is fluid friction. As from the name of fluid friction, we can just comment that this friction just happen in fluid. Jumping with a parachute is the example of fluid friction. Whenever anyone uses a parachute, that means he jumps on air, so there a frictional force occurs, and this friction is fluid friction. So we have known about different types of friction here. Next we will try to discuss about the process of increasing and decreasing friction, because friction is necessary, but sometimes we have to reduce the friction. We are to reduce friction, so we have to know the ways of increasing and decreasing friction. So friction can be reduced. So we can just make some points here. Friction can be reduced by, first of all, making surface smooth. If the surface becomes smoother, then friction will be reduced in a greater way. The second way is by using lubricants. For example, oil, mobile grease. If you use these kinds of lubricants, the resistive force will be lower there, and that will reduce the friction. Third way is using ball bearing. In different vehicles we should just see the use of ball bearing, and this is just used for reducing the friction. The fourth way is using wheels, because the use of wheels reduces the resistive force, and it just reduces the friction. And another way of reducing friction is by minimizing the surfaces where friction occurs. To contact surfaces where friction occurs, if we can minimize that area, then frictional force will be reduced, and so total friction will be reduced. And the final way for reducing friction is by reducing vertically applied force. As much as force is applied on object, there will be so much resistive force. If we can just reduce vertically applied force, the opposite reaction force will be reduced as well, and that reaction force is frictional force. So by reducing vertically applied force, we can reduce the friction as well. So boys, we have seen several points that can be used for reducing friction. There are some ways that can be used for increasing friction. Let's have a look on those points. Friction can be increased by roughening the surfaces where friction is present. We have just seen earlier, if the surfaces are smooth, friction reduces here. So if we make the surface rough, then friction will increase. Then next one is pressing the surfaces more strongly where friction is present. In our earlier topics, we have seen that if we just release the applied force, we just reduce the applied force, then the friction will be reduced as well. So in the contrary of that, if we apply much pressure on the surface, then friction will be increased. Our third point is making the surface stationary by stopping the motion. If the two contacting surface are maintained in a stationary position, then we can increase the friction. Making grooves or waves on the frictional surfaces. If we use grooves or waves, that will help us to increase the friction. That means that will increase the resistive force, so that will increase the friction as well. Next, increasing the density of air and water. That means increasing the density of fluid whenever any vehicles or for example, we have seen that parachute moves in air. So if we can increase the density of that fluid, that will increase the barrier, and so that will increase the friction. Increasing the frictional area, if we can increase the contacting or frictional area, that will also increase the friction. And finally, removing the wheel or ball bearing, as we have discussed earlier, by using ball bearing or wheel, we can just reduce the friction. So if we remove this wheel or ball bearing, that will help us to increase the friction. So according to our situation, according to our demand, we have to increase or decrease the friction, and these are the processes by which we can increase or decrease friction. So boys, hope you have understood the points. Next, a very important question. This is a comprehension type question. Finally, I'm going to discuss some comprehension type question of this chapter. First one is, why friction is a necessary evil. Explain why friction is a necessary evil. We know that friction is necessary for our life. This is important, mandatory for our life, but sometimes because of friction we just face some problems as well. So this is called a necessary evil. Here we can make some points for our discussion. Friction is necessary in our life, but dissipation or loss of energy occurs due to friction. Whenever frictional force acts between two objects, some energies are lost here, and that just transforms into heat energy. So as a heat energy, some energies are dissipated here. So friction is, if we say that friction is necessary, why is it necessary? Friction is necessary because the motion of a body would never cease without friction. A moving particle, a moving object will cease its motion and will break, will stop. Then without friction it won't be able to stop. So the motion of a body would never cease without friction. Next, we can walk because friction occurs between our shoes and ground. If the frictional force wouldn't occur here, so we couldn't walk so easily. For example, we just see this whenever we try to walk over sand. Then as the frictional force just minimized on here, so we can't walk easily over sand. Third one is, friction has made possible to write on paper. And for our writing, frictional force is mandatory. Then by creating resistance with air, that means by creating friction, parachute approaches safely to the ground. If parachute tries to approach to the ground, so it has to be stopped, or it has to be blocked with any barrier, and that barrier is our frictional force. So by creating resistance with air, a parachute approaches safely to the ground. So friction is necessary. We can construct building and fix nails due to friction. In many kinds of works, we just use the frictional force for our convenience. In spite of having so much advantages, friction has so many disadvantages as well. Some points are included here. This is treated as evil because due to these, or that means due to friction, vehicles cannot move freely. That means it's just create a resistance in the motion of vehicles. Vehicles cannot move freely. And then energy is lost by heat due to friction. As I have told earlier, energy is dissipated due to friction, and that is converted into heat, and we just can't use this heat. So this is a loss of energy. Third one is, vehicles need extra fuel due to friction. As friction is a resistive force, so if vehicles try to move with a smooth way, so they need extra fuel here. So we have seen so many contexts, so many points here that tells us why friction is necessary and what are the disadvantages of friction. So considering all the points, we can just say that this is necessary, though this is an evil, but this is necessary for our life, so we can say this is a necessary evil. I have included so much points here as this is a comprehension based question and the marks for this type of question is only 2. So boys, you can write 2 or 3 important points here only for your exam. Okay. Another comprehension based question is impulsive force is the change of momentum. As you have known about momentum, what is momentum? The product of mass and velocity is called momentum, and change of momentum means initial multiplication of initial velocity with mass, and the difference between multiplication of that means product of mass and final velocity. The difference of these two terms is called the change of momentum. But impulsive force, what is impulsive force? The impulsive force is the product of force and time. Only if we just multiply force with time, that will be called the impulsive force. So from Newton's second law, we just know that the rate of change of momentum is equal to applied force. That means force F equals change of momentum divided by time. This is the rate of change of momentum. So then F equal F into 2t. If we just make calculation here, the Ft equals mv minus mu ft. Ft means force, product of force and time. This is called impulsive force. That means impulsive force equals the change of momentum. Boys, I want to mention another point here. What will be the unit of impulsive force? As this is a quantity, so it will must have a specific unit. What will be the unit? As this is a product of force and time, so the unit will be Newton second. So now we have understood that impulsive force is the change of momentum. So, this is an comprehension type question. You have some other comprehension type question in this chapter. Another example is explain how we work, and other example is when a shot is fired from a gun, the gun pushes backwards. Explain the reason. The answer is common for these two questions. You can use the concept of Newton's third law here, or the concept of conservation of momentum. By using these two terms, you can explain these two questions. So I hope you will try to solve or try to explain this question, and you can explain it as well. So boys, total discussion about different topics of this chapter are finished here, and in my next class I will try to show some creative type questions to you. Before that, you just make a total review of this chapter, review of all topics, and you just practice some CQ type question, creative type questions at home, and you just make hand notes that you can show after this break, after this vacation, whenever your class will be started again. You have to show some hand notes of online classes, so just make a note and that will be counted for your SBM marks. So boys, this is an important chapter, I told you earlier, so just make a proper review of this chapter. Okay boys, that's all for today. In our next class, we will try to discuss more things, more topics. Till then, goodbye to all of you. Thank you.